In an article, the Venerable Thomas Downing, Black Oyster King of New York, in the Oysters My World, History of Oysters and Oyster Cultivation, Thomas Downing's story appears. It is quite hard to imagine how a son of freed black slaves could start up and manage a flourishing oyster business almost 200 years ago during the polarizing antebellum period, the age of slavery and violent oppression of blacks, and be so mourned as a highly respected member of the community that the New York Chamber of Commerce closed for his funeral in 1866. But this is exactly what happened to Thomas Downing. Thomas was born in 1791, the son of former black slaves who had been owned by Captain John Downing in the middle of the 18th century. But as a staunch Methodist, he was persuaded to free his slaves as it was deemed contrary to Christian beliefs. Thomas's parents assumed their former owner's rather famous last name. They were appointed caretakers of the church's meeting house that had been established by the Downing family in 1783 in Virginia, on the eastern side of the Chesapeake Bay. At the meeting house and in John Downing's home, Thomas's parents served the leading families of Virginia, and Thomas grew up learning about refined tastes and elegant dining delivery. Thomas's parents also acquired land near John Downing's, perhaps allocated to them by him. The young Thomas was born free in a state that condoned slavery. His playmates were white children of the local well-to-do, one of whom was to become the governor of Virginia, Henry Wise. Because they lived by the bay, as a youngster Thomas learned how to rake and harvest oysters, dig for clams, and generally work on the land, which bordered the Atlantic coast. He later described his parents' home as, quote, humble and unpretending, but bore the impression of industry, taste, and happiness, end quote. He said that his family members were, quote, famed for their strength, agility, and general aptness, and enjoyed the reputation of being ready and able to defend their rights, end quote. As I tell their stories, this tradition of working for civil rights and energetic work ethic is repeated throughout family generations. Thomas Downing left home claiming by some accounts to not be satisfied when asked to serve with the young United States troops against the British in the War of 1812. Like many other blacks, he traveled north and settled for a time in Philadelphia, where he met his future wife, Rebecca West. The couple had 5 children: George, twins Thomas and Henry, Jane, and Peter William. Downing decided to leave Philadelphia and moved to New York in 1819. One of the reasons he decided on New York may have been his interest and expertise in handling oysters. Soon after his arrival there, he registered as an oysterman, which was at the time an occupation often held by freed blacks, many of whom settled in Staten Island. In 1810, of the 27 oystermen listed in the New York City Directory, at least 16 were free black Americans. Another reason may have been the existence of quite an independent community of blacks, mostly freed slaves, who were later granted the right to vote in 1821, although slavery was not abolished until 1827 in New York. Downing bought himself a boat and started in the oyster business, which would make a lot of sense given his previous experience back in Virginia. He loved his oysters, and after a few years decided to set up a shop where he could sell the oysters he harvested. In 1825, he opened Downing Oyster House, an establishment that could only serve white clients in those segregated times. It was renowned for its classiness that marked it an institution in the city. It was strategically located on the corner of Broad and Wall Street, close to the centers of commerce, banks, the customs house, the merchants' exchange, and shopping at department stores. Its interior was lush and ornamental, with soft carpets, damask curtains, gold leaf carvings, chandeliers, and mirrored hallways. His was the only oyster house that attracted the aristocracy, the elite of white society, politicians, rich businessmen, intellectuals, professionals, and foreign dignitaries, as well as ladies in the company of their husbands and chaperons. The most respected families of the city came to, quote, enjoy a repast which would cause their sons and daughters to long for frequent repetitions, end quote. His son George Downing recalled that, quote, ladies and gentlemen with towels in hand and an English oyster knife made for the purpose would open their own oysters, dip them into the burning hot concave shell of sweet butter and other seasonings, and partake of a treat. Thomas Downing not only perfected oyster dishes and sumptuous presentations, but knew how to secure the best the sea offered. He was proud that he could offer his guests the finest and freshest oysters available, and was known to treat the captains of local oyster vessels who brought oysters from various parts along the eastern seaboard in a generous manner. It was said that Downing often snuck out in the dead of night on a skiff to intercept incoming oyster boats, to negotiate with local oystermen on their way into harbor, and purchase the finest catch before they reached port. Years later, his son George characterized Thomas as being, quote, extremely active, who knew not tire. Downing also marketed his own pickled oysters in a stone crock jar, stamped in dark blue lettering with his name and address. Today these jars are a collector's dream. As his business grew and he extended his premises to neighboring buildings, he decided to start a catering enterprise for the newly popular 19th century celebration of events like launching a new steamboat or opening the doors of a big company, when a socialite decided to throw a party, or for the special government affair. He sealed his reputation with one special event, the Boz Ball. It was written that the great man of oysters was asked to provide the refreshments for the Boz Ball that was arranged to welcome Charles Dickens in 1842 to the city, where 3,000 New Yorkers turned up. It was a massive event that impressed the British writer. It was major, and a sumptuous feast included 50,000 oysters, 10,000 sandwiches, 40 hams, 76 tongues, 50 rounds of beef, 50 jellied turkeys, 50 pairs of chicken, 25 of duck, and 2,000 mutton chops, all before the desserts were brought out. Downing was paid a fortune, $2,200, a princely sum in these days. Downing Oyster House became a New York trademark, exporting his oysters even to Paris and London. Queen Victoria showed her gratitude for the oysters he shipped to her by sending him a gold watch in appreciation. He even saved the New York Herald newspaper from going bankrupt by advancing its founder, Gordon Bennett, a loan of $10,000. Unbeknownst to many of his clients, Downing and his family had joined the Underground Railroad, founded in 1830, as a network of secret routes and safe houses to help slaves escape either to Florida, then a Spanish colony, or to British North America, Canada, during the first half of the 19th century. It seemed as though his premises were used as one of the stations to hide fleeing slaves heading north. His cellars were used for this purpose, and his son later recalls that he harbored many a runaway slave. Downing helped to found an all-black United Anti-Slavery Society in New York in 1836. He was also dedicated to improving the quality of education for black children and involved himself in what was called the African Free School. Downing championed the cause of equal voting rights for every citizen, irrespective of color, and through black organizations petitioned the state legislature in Albany from the end of the 1830s onwards, though he did not live long enough to see it achieved in 1870. His religious beliefs were strong. He was a member of St. Philip's Episcopal Church, the only black congregation in New York. Downing was a generous man who supported not only the church, but also donated money to those in need and joined various benevolent organizations. One New York newspaper described him as, quote, one of the most respected and age-colored men in the city. His private character is without reproach. Downing was praised for his humility, modesty, and for, quote, the magnitude of his donations for the relief of his oppressed race, end quote. Thomas Downing managed to survive the violent race riots during the 4-year bloody Civil War, when blacks in New York City were randomly lynched and murdered on the streets, being blamed for the slaughter and suffering inflicted on Unionist troops. So after a successful life in the oyster business, having been a tireless advocate of black rights, the abolitionist movement, equal suffrage, and accessibility of high school education for black children, as well as a generous donor to black charitable causes, he died a wealthy man in 1866. As a mark of respect, the New York City Chamber of Commerce closed for the day of his funeral.